The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Arizona territory as Samuel Morrison stepped out of his ranch house, coffee in hand. The year was 1873, and life on the frontier was never easy, but Samuel had carved out a good living from the harsh land. His cattle grazed on thousands of acres, and his small ranch hands worked hard to keep everything running smoothly. Samuel was different from most ranchers in the territory. While many settlers viewed the Apache people as nothing but trouble, Samuel had always believed that all people deserved respect and kindness. His father had taught him that a man's character wasn't determined by the color of his skin or the language he spoke, but by his actions and his heart. That particular morning started like any other. Samuel was checking on his cattle when he noticed something unusual near the creek that ran through his property. Smoke was rising from a small campfire, barely visible through the cottonwood trees. This was strange because none of his ranch hands should have been camping in that area. Curiosity got the better of him, and Samuel rode his horse toward the smoke. As he got closer, he could see figures moving around the fire. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle on his saddle, not out of aggression, but out of caution. The frontier could be dangerous, and a smart man was always prepared. When Samuel reached the creek, he found something that made his heart heavy. There, huddled around a small fire, was an Apache family. A man, a woman, and 3 children, the youngest barely old enough to walk. They looked tired, hungry, and desperate. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and the children's faces were thin from lack of food. The Apache man stood up quickly when he saw Samuel approaching. His name was Running Bear, though Samuel wouldn't learn this until later. Running Bear's hand moved to the knife at his belt, ready to protect his family if necessary. The woman, whose name was Morning Star, pulled the children closer to her. Samuel raised his hand in a peaceful gesture and slowly climbed down from his horse. He could see the fear in their eyes, and it broke his heart. These weren't warriors or raiders. This was just a family trying to survive. "Easy there," Samuel said softly, using the few Apache words he had picked up over the years. "I mean no harm." Running Bear's eyes searched Samuel's face, looking for any sign of deception. Most white men who found Apache families on their land would either shoot first and ask questions later, or ride straight to the nearest fort to bring soldiers. But something about Samuel was different. There was kindness in his eyes, not hatred or fear. The youngest child, a little girl about 4 years old, was clearly sick. She had a fever and was coughing badly. Morning Star looked at Samuel with pleading eyes, the universal look of a mother desperate to help her child. Samuel's heart went out to them immediately. He thought of his own wife, Margaret, and their 2 children back at the ranch house. What would he do if his family was in the same situation, hungry and afraid, with a sick child and nowhere to go? "You're on my land," Samuel said gently, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Running Bear nodded, understanding more English than he could speak. He pointed to himself and his family, then made gestures indicating they would leave. But Samuel held up his hand again. "No," he said, "you don't have to go." This surprised Running Bear. In recent years, the relationship between white settlers and Apache people had grown worse and worse. The government was forcing Apache tribes onto reservations, often with little food or supplies. Many Apache families were starving, and some had tried to return to their traditional lands to hunt and gather food. This usually led to conflicts with settlers and soldiers. Samuel could see that this family was probably running from something. Maybe soldiers, maybe other settlers, maybe just the terrible conditions on the reservation. Whatever their story was, they needed help. And Samuel Morrison was not the kind of man who could turn away people in need. "My wife knows about healing," Samuel said slowly, using simple words and hand gestures to make sure Running Bear understood. "She can help your little girl." Morning Star's eyes filled with hope. She had been watching her daughter get sicker every day, and she was terrified of losing her child. Traditional Apache remedies weren't working, and they had no access to white man's medicine. Samuel mounted his horse and gestured for the family to follow him. Running Bear was hesitant. This could be a trap. The white man might be leading them to soldiers or other settlers who would kill them. But looking at his sick daughter, he knew they had to take the chance. The walk back to Samuel's ranch house was tense. Running Bear kept looking around, expecting to see soldiers or armed men waiting for them. But Samuel led them straight to his home, where his wife Margaret was hanging laundry on the line. Margaret Morrison was a strong woman who had followed her husband to the frontier because she believed in his dream of building something good in the wilderness. When she saw Samuel approaching with an Apache family, she didn't scream or run inside for a gun like many frontier women would have done. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward them with a concerned expression. "They need help, Margaret," Samuel said simply. "The little one is sick." Margaret looked at the fevering child in Morning Star's arms and immediately understood. She had been a nurse back in Missouri before marrying Samuel, and she had seen enough sick children to know when one was in serious trouble. "Bring them inside," she said without hesitation. This was almost unheard of in 1873 Arizona. White families didn't invite Apache people into their homes. The two cultures were supposed to be enemies, but the Morrisons were guided by their Christian faith and their belief that all people were children of God. Inside the ranch house, Margaret quickly prepared a bed for the sick child and began examining her. She had pneumonia, which could be deadly if not treated properly. Margaret sent Samuel to get some of her medicinal herbs and began preparing treatments that she had learned from both white doctors and native healers she had met over the years. Running Bear and Morning Star watched nervously as the white woman cared for their daughter. They had heard stories of white people poisoning native children, but something about Margaret's gentle manner convinced them she truly wanted to help. Throughout that first day, Margaret worked tirelessly to break the child's fever. She gave her herbal teas, applied cool cloths to her forehead, and used steam treatments to help her breathing. Samuel made sure the family had food and water, giving them the first good meal they had eaten in weeks. As evening approached, the little girl's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and smiled weakly at her mother. Morning Star began to cry with relief, and she took Margaret's hand, speaking rapidly in Apache. Samuel didn't need to understand the words to know she was expressing her gratitude. That night, Samuel offered to let the family stay in his barn, where they would be warm and safe. Running Bear was still suspicious, wondering if this was all too good to be true. In his experience, white men who seemed kind usually wanted something in return, and that something was often dangerous for Apache people. But as Samuel prepared a comfortable area in the barn with blankets and pillows, Running Bear began to believe that maybe this white rancher was different. Maybe there were still good people in the world, even among those who were supposed to be his enemies. Before going to sleep, Running Bear asked Samuel why he was helping them. Using a mixture of English, Apache, and hand gestures, Samuel explained that he believed all families deserved to be safe and healthy. He talked about his own children and how he would hope someone would help them if they were ever in trouble. This simple act of human kindness was about to change everything. Word of Running Bear's family being helped by a white rancher would spread quickly through the Apache community, and by morning, Samuel Morrison would wake up to a sight that would both terrify and amaze him. As Running Bear settled down to sleep that night, he made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He pulled out a small mirror from his belongings, one of the few possessions the family had managed to keep during their desperate flight. It was a signal mirror, used by Apache scouts to communicate across long distances using reflected sunlight. In the darkness of the barn, Running Bear carefully positioned the mirror and waited for dawn. He had a message to send, and by morning, That message would bring an incredible response that would test Samuel Morrison's kindness in ways he never imagined. Samuel Morrison woke up to the sound of his rooster crowing, just like every other morning for the past 5 years. But as he stretched and prepared to start his daily routine, he heard something else that made him freeze. It was a low rumbling sound, like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. Margaret stirred beside him. "What's that noise, Samuel?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. Samuel got out of bed and walked to the window. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Covering the hills around his ranch, as far as the eye could see, were Apache warriors on horseback. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, sitting silently on their horses, watching his ranch house. "Dear Lord," Samuel whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. Margaret joined him at the window and gasped when she saw the massive gathering of warriors. "Samuel, what have we done?" she whispered, fear evident in her voice. Samuel's mind raced. Had he made a terrible mistake by helping Running Bear's family? Was this some kind of trap? Were all these warriors here to attack his ranch and kill his family? He had always tried to be fair to the Apache people, but maybe his kindness had been seen as weakness. "Get the children," Samuel said quietly to Margaret. "Take them to the root cellar and stay there until I figure out what's happening." But Margaret shook her head. "No, Samuel. We're in this together, whatever it is." Samuel grabbed his rifle from beside the bed, though he knew that one gun would be useless against so many warriors. He had maybe a dozen bullets. While there appeared to be nearly 1,000 Apache fighters surrounding his property. As Samuel stepped out onto his front porch, the morning sun caught the metal of weapons, war paint, and horse gear, creating an almost supernatural sight. The Apache warriors sat completely still, like statues carved from stone. There was no yelling, no war cries, no threatening gestures. They just watched and waited. Samuel's ranch hands were nowhere to be seen. They had probably spotted the warriors at dawn and fled for their lives. Samuel couldn't blame them. Any reasonable person would run when faced with such an overwhelming force. At that moment, Running Bear emerged from the barn. Samuel's first thought was that this had all been planned, that Running Bear had somehow signaled for these warriors to come and attack. But as Running Bear walked toward the warriors, Samuel realized something strange was happening. Running Bear wasn't walking like a man who was about to watch his white enemies be slaughtered. Instead, he moved with purpose and dignity, like someone about to perform an important ceremony. He stopped halfway between the ranch house and the nearest group of warriors and began speaking in Apache. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the tone. Running Bear was explaining something, gesturing toward the ranch house and then toward his family in the barn. The warrior, who seemed to be the leader of the nearest group, nodded and responded with what sounded like questions. This conversation continued for several minutes while Samuel stood on his porch, rifle in hand, not knowing whether he was about to die or witness something incredible. Margaret stood beside him now, their 2 children, 8-year-old Tommy and 6-year-old Sarah, peeking out from behind her skirts. Finally, Running Bear walked back toward Samuel. The Apache man's face was serious but not threatening. When he reached the porch, he spoke in his broken English. "They come to see the white man who helped Apache family," Running Bear said simply. Samuel was confused. "They came here because I helped you?" Running Bear nodded. In Apache way, when someone shows great kindness to family, the whole tribe must know. When someone saves Apache child, this is sacred thing, very important. Samuel began to understand. The signal mirror he had seen Running Bear with the night before hadn't been used to call for an attack. It had been used to send a message about the kindness he had shown to an Apache family. "Last night, I sent message to my brother, who is scout for Chief Victorio," Running Bear explained. "I tell him about White Rancher who saved my daughter's life. My brother sends message to others. Word spreads fast in Apache Nation." Samuel's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "You mean all these warriors came here because they heard I helped your family?" "Yes," Running Bear said, "but they come not to make war. They come to see if story is true. Apache people have been hurt many times by white men who say one thing but do another. They want to see with their own eyes the white man who keeps his word and shows kindness to Apache children." At that moment, the leader of the nearest group of warriors dismounted from his horse and began walking toward the ranch house. He was an older man with streaks of gray in his long black hair and scars that spoke of many battles. His presence commanded respect, and even from a distance, Samuel could see the intelligence and strength in his eyes. Running Bear straightened up with obvious respect. "This is Broken Arrow, war chief under Victorio. He is very important man among our people." Broken Arrow approached the porch and stopped a few feet away from Samuel. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, sizing each other up. Samuel could feel the weight of history between their two peoples, all the broken treaties, the violence, the mistrust on both sides. Finally, Broken Arrow spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "You are the rancher who saved Apache Child?" "I am Samuel Morrison," Samuel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "And yes, I helped this family because they needed help." Broken Arrow nodded slowly. "Running Bear tells us you brought his family into your home when the child was dying. He says your woman used her medicine to save little girl's life. He says you gave them food and shelter and asked for nothing in return." "That's right," Samuel said. "Any decent person would have done the same thing." This statement seemed to surprise Broken Arrow. "No," he said firmly. "Most white men would not do same thing. Most would shoot first or bring soldiers. You are different." Broken Arrow then did something that shocked Samuel. The war chief reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a beautifully crafted Apache bracelet made of silver and turquoise. He handed it to Samuel. "This belonged to my grandfather, who was great chief," Broken Arrow said. "I give it to you because you showed true courage. It takes no courage to kill enemy. It takes great courage to help enemy when you could be punished for it." Samuel accepted the bracelet with trembling hands, understanding that this was a tremendous honor. Margaret gasped quietly beside him, recognizing the significance of the moment. But Broken Arrow wasn't finished. He turned and made a gesture toward the assembled warriors. Immediately, they all began dismounting from their horses. Samuel watched in amazement as nearly 1,000 Apache warriors climbed down from their mounts and began walking toward his ranch house. "What's happening?" Samuel asked, his heart racing again. "They want to see you," Running Bear explained. "In Apache tradition, when a man shows great honor, the warriors want to look upon him and remember his face. They want to tell their children and grandchildren about the white rancher who saved Apache family." For the next several hours, something unprecedented happened in the Arizona Territory. One by one, Apache warriors approached Samuel Morrison's front porch. They didn't come as conquerors or enemies, but as men showing respect to another man who had done something honorable. Some of the warriors brought gifts: a beautifully carved wooden flute, a piece of Apache jewelry, a small painted stone that represented protection for his family. Others simply nodded respectfully or spoke a few words in Apache that Running Bear translated as blessings and thanks. Margaret served water and what food they had to as many warriors as possible. She was nervous at first, but she quickly realized that these men meant no harm. Many of them smiled kindly at her children, who had gotten over their initial fear and were fascinated by the colorful war paint and feathers. Young Tommy, Samuel's 8-year-old son, was particularly brave. He approached one of the younger warriors and showed him his collection of arrowheads that he had found around the ranch. The warrior was impressed and gave Tommy one of his own arrows as a gift, carefully breaking off the sharp point first to make it safe. As the day progressed, Samuel learned more about why this gathering was so significant. Broken Arrow explained that the Apache people had been forced onto reservations where conditions were terrible. Many families were starving, and children were dying from diseases and lack of proper food. The government had broken promise after promise, and trust between Apache people and white settlers had almost completely disappeared. "Your kindness gives us hope," Broken Arrow told Samuel. "It shows us that not all white men have stones for hearts. When Apache children hear story of white rancher who saved Apache child, maybe they will believe that someday our peoples can live in peace." Samuel was deeply moved by these words. He had simply done what felt right in his heart, but he was beginning to understand that his simple act of kindness had much larger implications. In a time when the two cultures seemed destined for endless conflict, he had shown that understanding and compassion were still possible. As the sun began to set, the warriors started preparing to leave. But before they departed, Broken Arrow had one more surprise for Samuel. He called out in Apache, and several warriors brought forward something that made Samuel's jaw drop. It was a magnificent horse, a beautiful paint stallion with distinctive markings. The horse was clearly valuable, the kind of animal that would be prized by any rancher. "This horse is gift from Chief Victorio himself," Broken Arrow announced. "He says any man who shows such kindness to Apache children deserves finest horse in our herd." Samuel was overwhelmed. "I can't accept such a valuable gift," he protested. But Broken Arrow shook his head. "To refuse gift from great chief would be insult. You must accept." Samuel understood that this was about more than just a horse. It was about respect, honor, and the hope for better relationships between their peoples. He accepted the horse with gratitude, knowing that this day would change his life forever. As the warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Broken Arrow had final words for Samuel. "Word of what you did will spread throughout Apache Nation. You will always be welcome in Apache territory. If you ever need help, send message to Victorio, and Apache warriors will come to your aid." With that promise, the 1,000 riders began to leave, disappearing into the hills as silently as they had come. By full darkness, Samuel's ranch was quiet again, but everything had changed. He was no longer just a rancher trying to make a living on the frontier. He had become a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of what was possible when people chose kindness over fear. The story of Samuel Morrison and the 1,000 Apache riders didn't end when the warriors disappeared into the desert hills. In fact, it was just the beginning of something much larger that would echo through history and change the lives of countless people in the Arizona Territory. Word of the extraordinary gathering spread quickly throughout the frontier. Other ranchers, soldiers, and settlers heard the tale and couldn't believe it at first. 1,000 Apache warriors had surrounded a single ranch, and instead of violence, there had been a ceremony of honor and respect. Some people called it impossible. Others whispered that it was the work of magic or spirits. Samuel found himself at the center of attention he never wanted. Newspaper reporters traveled from as far as San Francisco and Denver to interview the rancher who had earned the respect of Chief Victorio's warriors. The story was printed in newspapers across the country, making Samuel famous from coast to coast. "Miracle on the Frontier," read one headline. "Rancher's kindness stops Apache war party," proclaimed another. But Samuel wasn't comfortable with all the attention. He continued working his ranch, caring for his family, and treating all people with the same kindness he had shown Running Bear's family. The magnificent paint stallion that Chief Victorio had given him became his most prized possession, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. Running Bear and his family stayed on Samuel's ranch for several more weeks while their daughter fully recovered her strength. During that time, Running Bear helped with ranch work, proving to be an excellent horseman and cattle handler. The two men developed a friendship that transcended cultural differences, built on mutual respect and shared values. Before Running Bear's family left to rejoin their people, he made Samuel a promise that would prove prophetic. "Your kindness will be remembered by Apache people for all generations," he said. "Your children and their children will always be safe in Apache lands." This promise was tested sooner than anyone expected. 3 months after the gathering of warriors, Samuel received devastating news. A group of cattle rustlers had been operating in the area, stealing livestock from several ranches and selling them in Mexico. These weren't ordinary thieves, but dangerous men led by a vicious outlaw named Jake Morrison, who ironically shared Samuel's last name but none of his moral character. Jake Morrison's gang had been growing bolder, and they had killed 2 ranchers who tried to stop them. The territorial authorities seemed powerless to catch the outlaws, who knew the desert country well and had hideouts in remote canyons where lawmen feared to follow. One morning, Samuel woke up to find that 20 of his best cattle were missing. Tracks around his property showed clear signs that the Morrison gang had struck during the night. Samuel's ranch hands were furious and wanted to form a posse to track down the thieves, but Samuel knew that would likely lead to bloodshed and death. "We'll report this to the territorial marshal," Samuel decided. "Let the law handle it." But his foreman, a tough man named Pete Williams, shook his head grimly. "Boss, the law can't catch these men. They know every hiding place in 100 miles. By the time any marshal organizes a search, those cattle will be in Mexico, and the gang will be planning their next raid." Samuel knew Pete was right, but he wasn't willing to risk his men's lives in a dangerous pursuit across the desert. Unknown to him, however, word of the cattle theft was already spreading through channels he couldn't have imagined. Running Bear, now living with his band about 50 miles away, heard about the robbery through Apache scouts who kept watch on all activities in their traditional territory. When he learned that Samuel Morrison's cattle had been stolen, he was outraged. The man who had saved his daughter's life was being victimized by criminals, and Running Bear felt honor-bound to act. That evening, Running Bear rode to the camp of Broken Arrow, the war chief who had led the ceremony at Samuel's ranch. He found the older warrior sitting by a fire, working on new arrows for an upcoming hunt. "Broken Arrow, my friend," Running Bear said as he dismounted. "I bring news that will anger you as it has angered me." Broken Arrow looked up from his work. "Speak, Running Bear. What troubles you?" "The white rancher who saved my daughter has been robbed by bad men. They took his cattle in the night like cowards and thieves." Broken Arrow's face darkened. "Samuel Morrison has been harmed?" "Yes. The outlaw Jake Morrison and his gang struck his ranch. They say this Morrison gang has killed other ranchers and that the white man's law cannot catch them." Broken Arrow stood up slowly, his eyes flashing with anger. "The man who showed great honor to Apache people has been wronged. This cannot stand." Within hours, Broken Arrow had sent messages to Apache bands scattered across the territory. The message was simple but powerful. Samuel Morrison, the friend of Apache children, needed help. The response was swift and overwhelming. Samuel knew none of this was happening. He spent the next day riding his property line, looking for more signs of the rustlers and trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't afford to lose many more cattle, but he also couldn't risk the lives of his family and workers by starting a war with dangerous outlaws. As evening approached, Samuel was returning to his ranch house when he saw something that made him rein in his horse and stare in amazement. Smoke signals were rising from hills all around his property. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens of them, creating a complex pattern of messages across the sky. Margaret came out of the house when she saw the signals. "Samuel, what's happening? Are we in danger?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. These are Apache signals, but I can't read what they're saying." They didn't have to wait long to find out. As darkness fell, Samuel heard the sound of approaching horses. But instead of the thunderous noise of 1,000 riders like before, this was a smaller, more purposeful group. Running Bear appeared out of the darkness, leading about 30 Apache warriors. But these weren't ceremonial visitors. These were fighters, armed and painted for war, their faces grim with determination. "Samuel Morrison," Running Bear called out as he approached the ranch house. "We have come to help you." Samuel stepped out onto his porch, confused but grateful to see his friend. "Running Bear, what are you doing here?" "We heard about the thieves who took your cattle," Running Bear replied. "Apache people do not forget kindness. When friend of Apache is wronged, Apache warriors make it right." Samuel was touched by the gesture, but he was also worried. "Running Bear, I appreciate this, but I don't want anyone to get hurt over some stolen cattle." Running Bear's expression was serious. "This is not just about cattle, my friend. This is about honor. You showed honor to Apache family. Now Apache must show honor to you." One of the other warriors, a young man with distinctive white paint across his face, rode forward. Running Bear introduced him as Swift Eagle, one of the best scouts in Chief Victorio's band. "Swift Eagle has been tracking the thieves," Running Bear explained. "He knows where they hide." Swift Eagle spoke rapidly in Apache, and Running Bear translated. "He says the outlaws are camped in Devil's Canyon, about 20 miles north. They think they are safe because no white lawmen will follow them there, but they did not think about Apache warriors." Samuel was amazed by the offer of help, but he had concerns. "Running Bear, if Apache warriors attack white outlaws, even bad ones, it could cause trouble with the territorial government. They might use this as an excuse to send more soldiers against your people." This was a legitimate worry. Tensions between the Apache and the U.S. government were already high, and any incident could be used to justify harsh military action against Apache communities. But Broken Arrow, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "Samuel Morrison, you think like wise man, always considering others before yourself. But sometimes, good men must take action against bad men, or evil grows stronger." Broken Arrow had a plan that was both clever and honorable. "We will not attack these thieves as Apache warriors," he explained. "We will capture them and bring them to white man's law. That way, justice is served, but no one can say Apache people acted outside the law." The plan that Broken Arrow outlined was brilliant in its simplicity. The Apache warriors would surround the outlaw camp before dawn, when the thieves would be sleeping and least prepared. Instead of killing them, which would have been the easier option, they would capture the entire gang alive and bring them to the territorial marshal in Tucson. Samuel was impressed but still worried about the risks. What if something goes wrong? What if someone gets hurt? Running Bear smiled for the first time that evening. "Samuel Morrison, Apache warriors have been moving through this desert for hundreds of years. We know every rock, every shadow, every sound. These outlaws will never know we are there until it is too late." Samuel realized that his Apache friends were determined to help him, whether he agreed or not. And truthfully, he was tired of being a victim. The Morrison gang had terrorized the territory long enough, and if there was a chance to stop them without unnecessary bloodshed, it was worth trying. "All right," Samuel decided, "but I'm coming with you." This declaration caused quite a stir among the Apache warriors. Running Bear translated Samuel's words, and several of the younger warriors looked impressed. Broken Arrow nodded approvingly. "You are brave man, Samuel Morrison," the war chief said. "But this work is dangerous. You have family to think about." Samuel looked back at his house, where Margaret and the children were waiting. He knew Broken Arrow was right, but he also knew that he couldn't let other men risk their lives for his problems without taking the same risks himself. "My family will be safe here," Samuel said. "And this is my fight too. Those men stole from me, and they'll keep stealing from others unless they're stopped." The Apache warriors spent the rest of the evening preparing for the mission. Samuel watched in fascination as they checked their weapons, painted their faces with special patterns for night fighting, and performed a brief ceremony asking for protection and success. Before dawn, the group set out for Devil's Canyon. Samuel rode beside Running Bear, still amazed that he was about to participate in an Apache raid against white outlaws. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He was probably the only white rancher in the territory who had Apache warriors as allies instead of enemies. The mission that followed would become another legend in the Arizona territory, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can achieve the most remarkable results. And it would cement Samuel Morrison's reputation as a man who had truly bridged two worlds, creating bonds of friendship and respect that would last for generations.